Hi everyone, my name is Leah Kopke and I'm a 3D motion design freelancer. I also have a podcast where each week I cover another 3D modeling tool for Cinema 4D. Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be 3D modeling some mid-century modern inspired furniture using the Loft tool. We're going to go through all of the settings for the Loft tool so that you know that tool inside and out. You can create your own creative furniture with it. You'll know the tool well enough to do that. And I'd love to see what you create. So hopefully if you actually go ahead and make yourself a table and some chairs, hopefully you'll show it to me on Instagram or on LinkedIn. I'd love to see it. And I'm so excited to get started. So let's go ahead and do that. So here we are inside of Cinema 4D. I have some very simple pieces of furniture made using the Loft. And you may find it a little bit surprising that these were made completely out of using these primitive splines with very little editing done to them. If I open up this Loft here and this one as well, you can see that I have a lot of splines within them. If I turn off my Loft and turn off my Loft here, you can see that this furniture is completely made from splines. So it's really wonderful that this is so simple and so easy to do. And you can get some pretty complex looking pieces of furniture with very little effort. Without much knowledge of 3D modeling tools, you can put something together pretty quick that makes you look like you know quite a bit of 3D modeling. I felt really inspired by a designer named Eero Saarinen, and he designed the tulip table, which was really groundbreaking at the time because it was designed after World War II. So this was the mid-century modern era. There were new materials, new types of plastics, new manufacturing techniques that were made during that time period that really changed how furniture looked. And people wanted something new and fresh, and mid-century modern was that look of that time. And this is one of those iconic pieces of furniture from that period. And there's a lot of great furniture you can make actually of that period using something as simple as the Loft tool, because the furniture was usually made using very simplistic forms, and it was a much more minimalistic period of design. If you ever feel stuck while designing some furniture and don't know where to go from there, there are a ton of great books on furniture design, and I have an entire collection of them. This is one that I like that specifically focuses on designing chairs, and this is basically it right here, Furniture Design. An Introduction to Development, Materials, and Manufacturing. So it's a really fun book. Even if you're not planning on designing furniture in the future or being an industrial designer, if you understand how things are made in real life, it helps you 3D model them. So check out some books. You don't need to become an industrial designer, but it does help you to understand design language while you're 3D modeling and to even understand the different periods of furniture and a little bit of design history. So you can see this table has a very similar shape to the tulip table, but I added actually these hard edges at the top, so it's not perfectly circular. And I also had these circular shapes form into this other shape here, which it has some harder edges. Here it's called the end side. So I used the end side spline along with the circle spline in order to create these. And you can see that these are actually in a very important hierarchy. And if I move these out of order, let's turn back on this table. If I were to move any of these out of order, like if I were to move this one in here, it'll throw off the calculations of how this table is being made. So the order in which you put your splines within this hierarchy communicate to Cinema 4D what's the first spline and what's the second one and how these are all connected. And that's how you create that form. So if I turn this off, you can see this is the bottom here. This is our base, and we can even name it base circle. And then we have our secondary circle. This is the upper part of our base. We can call this lower leg. So you can see we're building up this table from the bottom up. Upper leg. Table top. Or maybe we could call this table edge, and the next one could be called tabletop. You can sweep different kinds of splines in order to create different kinds of shapes, and Cinema 4D will smooth them together and have that nice transition. You actually have different options in here. So if I click on this loft here, and by the way, you can find the loft in here under your generators. You can also find it under the create menu under generators. So it's in both places here. It's a helpful tool. In our object tab, you can see that we have subdivisions in the U direction. If I decrease this, you can see that the U direction is actually going around this way. So we're adding more subdivisions along that direction. Subdivision V will add subdivisions in the opposite direction. So you can see as I decrease this, we are losing more detail. If you turn on per segment, check this on, it will apply this number of subdivisions per each segment. So between each part where there are two splines, so between this spline and this spline is being considered a segment. Between this spline and this spline here will also be considered a segment. So when it works like that, these splines that are closer together are going to have more subdivisions than the splines that are further apart. So you could have those two options on how you would like Cinema 4D to add in those subdivisions. I'm going to turn off per segment and increase this here because I think that makes it a little bit more even, and I like that for this instance, but you have options if your project needs something else. Now here are the isoparm subdivisions. The interesting thing about this is you'll only really be able to see it if you change your display mode to isoparms. And isoparms focus more on showing the curvature of an object than the actual topology of that object. So if you have a lot of polygons in your scene and it's starting to look cluttered, sometimes turning on isoparms can make your viewport look a little bit cleaner. I personally like to see what my topology is as I'm working, so I rarely use this, but it's an option that's good to be aware of in here. You can increase your number of isoparm subdivisions here, and that will just give you more of these segments. These segments are just showing the overall form. They aren't your topology. I'll go ahead and change this to organic form. There's different ways for Cinema 4D to calculate this loft and how it looks. If you turn on organic form, you'll see the shape of it changed a little bit. So you can try these different settings to change how this is actually being calculated. If you turn on loop, you'll see that it actually connects the last one to the first one. So now our base circle spline is being connected to our tabletop, and it's creating this loop. And that's why it's called loop. If we go in the inside of this, you'll see this is continuous. It never ends. There's a start and a stop, but it never completely ends. And it creates a loop. So depending on what you're making, maybe you need something that shape, and it's good to know that that's an option in here. You also have this other option called linear interpolation. So if you don't want these curves here, you just want straight lines, you can turn this on and it'll have a straight transition between each one of these splines. That's what linear interpolation does. If you enable adapt UV, it will detect the texture as being wrapped per segment. So we talked about what a segment is. It's the area between one spline and the next that's being calculated. So between the base circle and the upper base would be one segment, and between the upper base and lower base, that would be a separate segment. So when you have adapt UV on, that will make the texture based per segment. If you turn it off, it will just evenly distribute the texture throughout. If you turn on reverse normals, it will reverse the normals of your mesh. This mainly comes into play if you are creating something that has an open spline for it. So if we were to create something, perhaps let's make it in this view here. If we made a spline, like this, and this spline, now we can go ahead and duplicate it. And let's throw this into a loft. So this spline, unlike our other circular splines, is actually open. This spline is open, whereas the other ones were closed. So Cinema 4D will have a little bit more trouble figuring out what side should be the outside of the mesh and what side should be the inside. And it uses that direction to calculate what is the normal direction of the mesh. And that's a way of basically saying what's the inside and what's the outside for render calculations, 3D modeling calculations, and so on. So in order to have those calculations go smoothly, you want Cinema 4D to know which direction is your normal direction. So let's say we go ahead and make this editable so that we can click on the individual polygons to see what's the normal direction of these polygons. We can right click on this and choose current state to object, and we'll come up with this copy. That we can move over here. I'm going to change our display back to wireframe so that we can see this a little bit easier. I'll click on this here. Now you'll see that this has the orange side, which is actually the outside of the polygon on this side, and this side is the inside, and you can tell that by clicking on the polygons and seeing what color they are. What if while we were 3D modeling, we actually wanted this to be the reverse? We wanted this to be calculated as the outside of the object and this side to be calculated as the inside. Well, the way you would fix that is you could go back into your loft and you could choose reverse normals, and then we could create another copy of this and you'll see that it is swapped over here. So this is the new one, and you can see it's swapped from the old one if we click on these. So that's what reverse normals does. It's used mostly for calculations and making sure that everything is rendering properly. I'll go ahead and group these together and hide them. We'll run through some more settings for the loft. We've gone through all the object settings. We also have options for cap. So this one's a fun one, and it's similar to the other ones we've covered in the past. So if we go back to our table over here and click on caps, you can choose to have a start cap and an end cap. If you turn these off, they will disappear. If you turn them back on, they'll reappear. So you can choose if you want this to be open or not on the bottom and the top. You can choose your tessellation type. Make sure you're in wireframe. The hotkey for that is NH in order to see your topology here. You can choose to have an n-gon, is what's showing here. You could have triangles making up this cap here. You could have quadrangles. You could have Delaunay, which is a more even mesh that's useful for doing deformations like the bend or shear, taper. These here will calculate a little bit better with Delaunay or even with the regular grid option. I like the regular grid. It's very even. It's good for things like dynamic simulations, and you can adjust the size here. You can also make your grid quad dominant, and it will make it as out of as many quads as it can versus having triangles. So if you want fewer triangles in your mesh, regular grid is a great option for that. You can create bevels for the bottom and the top caps. If you would like to have separate controls for each, if you want a different type of bevel on the bottom and a different type of bevel on the top, you can select separate controls. Let's say for the bottom here, we would like this to be rounded. Then we can choose this round option here for the end. We can choose the round option here for the end and increase this. Let's make this bevel 0.2 to make it pretty small. You can choose the number of subdivisions you would like for that bevel here by scrolling this back and forth. I'll leave it with 5. You can adjust the tension. And if I look at the profile of this bevel here, you'll see what the tension does. Right now it's at 100%, so it's fully rounded. If I make it at 0, it will be linear because there will be 0 tension pulling it outwards or inwards to follow the surface curvature of these two surfaces that are adjacent to it. If you decrease your tension even further, it will actually go the opposite way and it will curve inwards. You have this option called extrusion. First, I'll set our tension back to 100%. If we turn on extrusion, you can actually extrude out your bevel. So you can choose an exact amount you want it to extrude out here. You can type it in manually or you can adjust it in here. In this instance, I'm going to turn off extrusion. I think that looks like a pretty nice bevel, so we'll move on from that. We have another option called step. So for this one, instead of working on the end of this table, let's work on the tabletop. For the tabletop, we can add a step formation here. So I'll increase the size and you can choose the number of steps. So now we have this really interesting step shape on our table that we can create. Maybe we want it to look like there is an interesting edge made to this table, but if we don't want this many steps, you can decrease the number of subdivisions and that decreases the number of steps. Then you could go ahead and reduce the size some if that's too large of a step for your liking. And now we have this nice interesting edge going around our table. You have the other settings like extrusion here, and you can even load a preset if you'd like. If you like one of the presets here, you could use that on your table for that edge. We also have this chair here, and I'm going to go ahead and select this now. We're going to keep our file nice and organized, so I'll name this chair so that if anyone else opens up this file, they aren't completely confused and there's some organization happening. Let's go ahead and talk about the spline option here. Let's create some separate controls and see what we can do for the spline. If I increase this and decrease this, you can see that we're affecting the top cap. So what's right here. And we could, if we wanted to feel really adventurous, we could make something ornate in here and we could draw our own spline. You can delete points along the spline. You can add points. If you want to add a point, you hit Control and click, and then you can adjust it here. You could even load your own preset for different types of spline shapes. If you want this to have a cosine shape, you could click on that there and you'll see it adjusts to fit that. You can adjust the size of this shape. You can't see the shape as clearly right now because we only have 2 subdivisions. If I increase this number, you can see the shape much better that it's making. And it's actually a very interesting shape here. I'll decrease this to 0.1 and decide, is that too small? Does that look right to me? I don't think that I actually like this shape, so we could try something else. We could ease in there to create another shape, but I just want you to know that that option is there and you can create something custom with a spline. You can adjust the tension as before and even add an extrusion if you would like. All those options are there. If we'd like to also add a bevel to the bottom of the chair, we can. Let's talk about what solid does. So I changed this tessellation to be Ngon because I wanted to be able to show that I think Ngon works a little bit better for when you're using the subdivision surface in this situation. And then you can go over to our solid option for end. We're working on the end since this is the end of the chair. You can increase the size and adjust the number of subdivisions. It usually doesn't take many subdivisions for the end shape using the solid. So I'm going to just have 1 actually for this instance. And when we drop this chair into a subdivision surface, so I'll click this here and I'll put this chair within the hierarchy of the subdivision surface, you'll see that because it added those extra loops around that edge, it has caused this nice clean bevel here. If we were to remove this entirely and not have any kind of solid, you'll see that it's we aren't really controlling the shape of the bevel there like we were before. So that's a nice way to be able to control the shape of the bevel even when you're subdivision surface modeling. Going to take this out of the subdivision surface, and I think I'll change this back to round just to keep things nice and simple. I'll add in a few subdivisions here. And let's go back to regular grid. You still have the option of extrusion and such with all of these. Bevel outside, if I select this here, and it will allow the form to become larger overall to compensate for the form of the bevel. If I turn this off, it'll remove that extra amount that was added here. And it's really easy to adjust the shape of your chair here. Let's say we aren't quite happy with this part here and how it looks. We could select these two circles here and we can move them up and further continue adjusting the shape of the chair. So you have a lot of creativity here. You can adjust this however you see fit. And whatever you think looks good. But that's a quick rundown of all of these options. Under the Caps tab, we have our last and final Selections tab. You can have polygon selections and edge selections for both 3D modeling and texturing your model. So let's go back over to our table here. I'll turn on the shell, cap, end cap, start bevel, end bevel. And you can turn on these edge selections as well. You can use these for 3D modeling. You can use these for all kinds of things. I'm going to show you how to add a specific material to a section. So I'll just add in a standard material. Or if you want to have some fun, you could even go into the asset browser and look up some of the materials in here. Let's find some nice wood materials. Let's make this table. We'll make it wooden for fun. You could also make it plastic if you want it to look. You could make it plastic, you could make it wood, you could make it stone. And the great thing about 3D is that you don't have to think about how hard this would be to manufacture out of wood or how hard this would be to manufacture out of stone. You can make it out of whatever you'd like, since it's all on your computer here. So let's go ahead and make this out of wood. I'll go ahead and drop this in here. We're downloading that asset. And just to show you how easy it is to control what part of your table is being affected by this texture, we're going to go ahead and add this to just the shell. So the name of the shell is S. So if we click on our texture and we change our selection to S, it will only apply that wooden texture to the shell of our table. And then that way you could add maybe a stone top or something else to the top of it. And you have all of these settings here where you could adjust this as well. You could change it to be cylindrical mapping. You could change it to be flat, to be cubic. You have all these options here. Some of these just don't work for this kind of shape. You could try shrink wrapping. That's an option as well. But that is how the selections work. I wanted you to be aware of that and how to add textures to what you're working on. For something like this, the texture is becoming a little bit stretched, so I think there's a part of me that would feel tempted to UV map this and texture it by hand, but it's not something that you would have to do, and depending on what you're modeling, you might not need to do that at all, and most of the time you can get away with one of these projection settings here instead of putting in all the time of UV mapping. If you did want to UV map this and you wanted to make this editable, you'd need to be able to make this editable in order to UV map it. You'd actually need to right click on this and choose make editable in order to make this editable, or you could make current state to object as your option. What that'll do is make a copy. I'll just make this editable here, and you'll see that everything just changes into one mesh that you can edit, and that makes it much easier to UV map if that's something you feel comfortable with doing. The main focus of this tutorial is just on how to 3D model with the Loft, so I won't go into UV mapping quite yet, but I wanted to show you how to do this. So this pretty much wraps up today's tutorial. Again, this is the end result that I came up with, but I'd love to see what you create. And it can be completely different from what I've done, just creating a piece of furniture or even a set of furniture using the Loft tool. I'd love to see what you do. And please, again, share it with me on Instagram or LinkedIn. I'd love to see it. And I'm sure that other people working on this would love to see what other people are doing too, because 3D modeling furniture is fun. And one of my favorite things while taking art classes is seeing what everyone else is doing and talking to people about their projects. So yeah, I think that it'd be fun if everyone actually 3D modeled this and showed what they made, because I love seeing what people do and hearing about it. So I hope to see your work, and I hope to see you next week. On the next episode, we'll go over another 3D modeling tool. So I'll see you next time. Happy 3D modeling.